This is our annual conference. It's our 8th annual conference, but it's actually our very first virtual conference. The Future of California Elections is a nonpartisan collaborative of election officials and community groups that have come together to make our elections and our democracy stronger. The future of California elections has been on the forefront of leading discussions on a variety of very critical issues for elections in our state. Everything from online voter registration to implementing the new motor voter law to same-day registration, moving forward with same-day registration, and most recently after the enactment of the Voters' Choice Act, we have led a project called Voters' Choice California, where we're working closely with election officials and other partners on how do we move Voters' Choice Act elections forward in a way that is accessible and make sure that everybody can cast a ballot with all of the options that are provided. I am delighted to announce that we are being joined in this conference by over 300 partners. So we hope to continue to be partners with all of you and hope that you can continue to work on our efforts. And this is why our partnerships are so important, right? This moment in our state's elections, at a time when we have unprecedented public health, social, and economic challenges, is also a challenge for our democracy. And we can't rise to these challenges without a strong and robust democracy. And that's why having this conference and working with all of you in partnership is so crucial for how we move forward as a state. Thank you again for joining us on behalf of the Future of California Elections staff, on behalf of our Board of Advisors, and on behalf of all of our members. Welcome to our virtual annual conference. And I'd now like to have our Executive Director of the Future of California, Astrid Ochoa, make some comment.
Good afternoon, and it is my pleasure to introduce Secretary Padilla this morning. I wanted to thank Secretary Padilla for joining us. We were supposed to be in person today, and we are here, not even a pandemic. I can't stop you from being part of our conference. So thank you, Secretary. I want to say just a couple of words. Thank you for your leadership. Since entering office in 2015, you've been focused on modernizing elections, overseeing the historic general election in 2018, which had the highest turnout in 1982. And just this February, we hit another milestone, or California hit over 20.6 million registered voters. So thank you for your leadership, Secretary Padilla. You've been working hard, your team has as well. And I thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely, Astrid. Don't be stealing too much of my thunder now. I do want to offer some welcoming remarks, and then I think you have some questions prepared for me to do a little back and forth to kick off this virtual conference. So thank you again for inviting me to be part of the FOS conference again this year, even as we gather under difficult circumstances and these virtual settings. First and foremost, I hope that everybody participating today is staying safe and healthy, and the same goes for their family and their loved ones. While COVID-19 has impacted every Californian, believe it or not, the number of cases and certainly the number of fatalities in California is relatively low given our very large and very diverse population. And that's thanks to our collective action in compliance with stay-at-home orders and other public health directives. So let's continue to do our part and continue to stay safe. Now, with public health officials and other frontline workers confronting the immediate impacts of the pandemic, it is we, the community that loves and cares about our democracy, that is charged with determining how we prepare for the November election and make sure that we administer the election in a way that is accessible, secure, and safe for everyone involved, for voters, for poll workers, for election staff, and everybody in between. But before I get to the November elections, let me acknowledge, as you did a minute ago, Astrid, that we first of all, thank all the elections workers in all parts of the state for their commitment, for their professionalism in this year's primary election, despite the circumstances that we were on the verge of. When I certified the election recently, I proudly reported that nearly 9.7 million California voters cast their ballot in the 2020 primary. That's a record high for California, and more than 1.1 million more ballots cast than just 4 years ago in the 2016 primary. The turnout of our eligible voting age population in California was the second highest in nearly 40 years. And get this, because I know we're into the weeds on this stuff, 13 of the 15 Voters' Choice Act counties exceeded the statewide turnout rate. So all the policies that we've been working together to adopt, all the policies that we've been working together to implement, and all the policies that we've been working together to inform the public on are making significant progress. So thank you again to all the elections personnel who worked tirelessly and delivered once again election results with accuracy and integrity, even as the pandemic was impacting California in the heart of our canvass period. Now, as we prepare for the November election, we start with acknowledging what the public health experts are already telling us, that the impact of COVID-19 are going to be with us for the foreseeable future. There's a chance of a second wave in the fall, and even without one, very, very unlikely there will be a vaccine that's been tested and deployed. And so there will be some level of physical distancing and other public health directives in place come November. But fortunately, I think California is well positioned to meet this moment. We already have many online tools to assist voters, including online voter registration, including ballot tracking and registration verification tools. You know, Governor Newsom last week signed an executive order making California the first state in the nation to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic by taking action to send every registered voter a ballot in the mail for the general election. In March, 75% of voters statewide received their ballots by mail. So that's the good news. We're not starting from scratch. But in a state with more than 20 million voters, or I think we're getting close to 21 million pretty soon, getting to 100% will still require a big effort for many, many counties. So just as I have advocated for funding for cybersecurity, for the upgrading and replacement of voting systems, I'm committed to fighting for the resources necessary from the federal government and from the state government to support counties as they expand to vote by mail printing, mailing, processing, etc. And while voting by mail is the safest and probably the most convenient way to vote during a health pandemic, let me be clear that I am not calling for an all vote by mail only election. I'm committed to maintaining as many in-person, safe, but in-person voting opportunities both on and before Election Day for voters who need assistance, voters who need to participate in same-day registration, etc. Now, I'm also excited to announce that the Secretary of State's office has retained some expert election consultants to assist counties in expanding vote-by-mail operations and other preparations for November. Amber McReynolds, Jennifer Morell, and Noah Prates are respected nationally for their leadership as election administrators. They've assisted numerous other states in improving elections, and they've come on board with California, not just with my office, but all 58 counties as partners to assist. And so their operational expertise will be invaluable as we prepare for November. But all that being said, we are still going to depend on the support and partnership and the help of the FOS community. For starters, we're going to need your help in educating over 20 million voters about the changes that are coming for the November election. We can afford a lot of opportunities, but their benefit will be limited if voters are not aware of them. So we're going to have to work together closely on that. Secondly, we'll also need to recruit thousands of new poll workers throughout the state and identify newer, safer, smarter voting locations. I want to take a moment to thank all of you that are participating today who have already engaged with us and offered your ideas and offered your resources. I know that working together, we will meet our obligation to providing an accessible, secure, and safe election come November. Our democracy and the people of California deserve nothing less. So thank you again, Astrid, and bring on the questions.
All right. Thank you, Secretary Padilla, for giving us that update. And I know everybody's been working really hard on a lot of this work. Sorry, I'm seeing the screen. Not sure why that is coming up. So I wanted to jump into the Q&A. And so, sorry, Secretary Padilla, technical challenges here as I'm navigating. And I want to jump into some of the questions that came in through the Q&A. You know, a lot of people talk about technology, and I know this is a very policy-specific conference, and you've answered this question in the past, but I think it's important to keep on acknowledging where we are with advancements, and people always question why California can't do online voting, and I want to just lead with that because I know it's a question that's top of mind for those that are not in the details of election administration.
Yeah. No, look, I think I get asked that question every single day and have been for years. And the bottom line is, right, if we go back to just a couple of months ago, before COVID-19 really consumed our thoughts and concerns, if we talked about the integrity of our elections, from a cyber threat standpoint, foreign interference standpoint, you know, those risks are still very much there. And the fact of the matter is that there's no technology that has been proven safe and secure from an election standpoint. The last thing that we need is to undermine either the elections itself or the perception that our elections are not secure. So until technology reaches a point where voting can be secure, we're not going to see it in California. Elections are very different than banking, than buying movie tickets, or, you know, ordering takeout. If somebody messes with, you know, the votes and the election results, our democracy pays a huge price. So nothing's been proven completely safe yet. So we're going to be very measured. But that doesn't mean we can't embrace other technologies to make registration easier. You made reference to online registration. We have automatic registration, or voting easier, whether it's vote by mail or giving voters the flexibility to go to any voting location in their county, convenient to them, through the Voters' Choice Act, which is growing in different parts of the state.
Mm-hmm. And we know that the executive order last week has now declared California the first state to say that they will send every voter a vote by mail ballot, but it's important to point out that that's not the only option for voting. So can you please talk to us a bit more about, like, what are the options? We know that the executive order has a deadline of May 30th. You've mentioned that your office has recruited some experts, national experts on this. So how close are we to understanding what the additional options for voting are going to look like?
Right. So I think there's a couple of things that sort of play together here. First, again, to reemphasize, the executive order from last week directs counties to send every registered voter a ballot in the mail by that E29 deadline, 29 days before the election. But it is not to be construed as a vote by mail only election. The executive order makes clear the commitment and the importance of maintaining as many in-person voting opportunities as possible, both on and before Election Day. So what we're waiting for is to finalize what the minimum requirements for each county should be. Not just how many locations, right? We have some benchmarks to work off of, you know, traditional polling place counties and the ratio of how many polling places for how many voters, or under the BCA model, how many vote centers for how many voters, also for how many days. Are we looking at just an election day election? Is it 4 days of voting, 11 days of voting? What's the right balancing act? So I think in our heart of hearts, we want to maximize the number of locations and days, but we're dealt with a very practical reality. To the extent that we can maintain those in-person voting opportunities, we've got to find new, safer locations, right? Conducting elections in a residential garage or at a senior home does not make sense anymore. So as many voting locations that we've used in the past are no longer viable options, how do we replace them with smarter locations and with larger locations? I mean, just think a traditional polling place, 20 voting booths side by side, that's gone. Spacing out by 6 feet requires larger square footage, just to give one example. And even if we had a lot of locations, they're useless if we don't staff them up. And a lot of the poll workers that we've relied on in the past, seniors and retirees, are the ones that are most vulnerable during this health pandemic. And so the need to recruit a new generation of poll workers in less than a few months is a big task. So, we're leveraging our partnerships that we've established over the years to not just remind people to register to vote or remind people to vote, but to look at employees of private companies and local governments and others to volunteer for the November election. But we're going to need your help. And as the weeks and the next couple of months come by, we'll get more granular information. Who needs our help more? Is it LA County? Is it San Diego? Is it Merced? Is it Tuolumne or Shasta? So it's all hands on deck time. Bring your Rolodexes to the table, your networks, your contact lists to the table. I'm aging myself here, but I know that working together will rise to the occasion.
Yeah. Yes, I think some of us still have Rolodexes. And then as we close out this segment, I know that we could definitely talk to you forever. There's a lot of questions that came in, but there is a lot to do. And I think what you're emphasizing there is that we're going to know how to prioritize as we get more information, as we get closer to the November election. But where can this network support you now in terms of the many items that were listed? Where can we support our election officials now?
Okay, so the executive order gave us a deadline of May 30th to finalize these in-person requirements. So I'll just alert everybody right now. It may come by way of urgency legislation, or if not, it may come by way of executive order. So as soon as we get clarity on that, we'll certainly be putting the information out. And look, you guys know my team, whether it's Jana Lane, head of our elections division, James Schwab, Chief Deputy Secretary of State, our communications team, Robert Negrete overseeing outreach, or others. We're working pretty tightly here. So anybody who wants to engage, we're setting up a task force to get your ideas, to get your suggestions, your potential leads on resources, so we can connect resources with the counties who need it the most. So stay tuned, and let's show the rest of the nation how it's done.
Great. Thank you, Secretary Dia, for joining us today, Secretary Dia. And thank you for your remarks. Thank you for your leadership. My best wishes to you, to your family, and to the SOS team.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. And now I will pass it over to our board member, Kathy Darling Allen, to continue.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kathy Darling Allen. I'm the Shasta County Clerk and Registrar of Voters. I'm also very proud to be the chairman of the board of the California Voter Foundation and a member of the advisory board for the Future of California Collaborative. And I really have valued my experience and my time with FOS. I was a founding member, and I cannot recommend FOS highly enough. Our opening panel this afternoon is going to explore a really important question, something that is pounding at the brains of all of us election officials, which is California prepared for November 2020? The panel is going to be moderated this afternoon by Jessica Huseman. And Jessica, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. I apologize if not. She's the lead reporter for ProPublica's Electionland project, which helps newsrooms across the U.S. cover ballot access issues in real time. This project has won awards from the Online News Association, the Global Editors Network, and the Society for Professional Journalists. Thank you, Jessica, very much for your time today and for leading this important discussion.
Great, thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here. I really appreciate it. I apologize in advance if there's a bit of background noise, but I will mute myself when I'm not talking. My internet went out this morning, so I'm sitting in the lobby of a Hampton Inn. I guess we're all doing what we have to do these days. I am pleased to have with me on this panel Neil Kelly, the Registrar of Voters for Orange County, California. They were the first county in the state to conduct an election under these terms, and he can speak to his experiences so far. We'll also have Fred Nissen, who is a supervising attorney for voting rights for Disability Rights California, who will talk about how these changes are impacting voters who need special assistance at the polls. And then also James Schwab, who is the Deputy Secretary of State for Policy and Planning for the Office of the California Secretary of State for Alex Padilla, who you just heard from. So I don't want to take up too much more time, so let's go ahead and move first to Neil Kelly, who will walk us through a few slides on his recent experiences. And if you have questions, please throw them in the Q&A. I'm going to hold audience questions until the last few minutes of the panel. But if you have any questions that come to mind while the panelists are talking, please type them right in there. All right, Neil, it's all you.
Hey, listen, I wanted to say, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here this morning or this afternoon and to talk about this important topic. I think all of us up and down the state, my colleagues, would say that we could all write books about things that we've experienced in elections, but who knew that the first chapter would be a pandemic, a global pandemic. And so this is just very odd times for me. I think one of the things that's important to point out is that election officials, and I know this, I see them in their hearts and my colleagues up and down the state, that we want to do the right thing. And even though it's a challenge moving into November, we stand the test to stand up and make sure that we're ensuring voters have the rights that they can cast a ballot fairly and freely. And so with that, I just want to talk about, and I don't know, can we advance my slides? I don't know if I can see those. While we're queuing those up, I just wanted to tell you that what I'd like to talk about today is in the weeds. 2 elections that we conducted just recently. Well, actually, we have one on Tuesday for a City of Santa Ana election under COVID-19 restrictions, an RLA under COVID-19 restrictions, and I'm currently managing a recount under COVID-19 restrictions. So this has all hit me at once. You can see there on the left, April 7th, we had a Westminster special election for a recall election. And what was unusual about that is that the governor's order allowing for limited in-person options came after we had already mailed the ballots and the voter information guide out to voters. So it was a challenge to try and step in and communicate to voters what those changes were. And then on the right there, you see on May 19th, we have a special election in the city of Santa Ana that's coming up. That was a little bit different because the governor's order came out before we mailed vote by mail ballots and voter information guides. So 2 different challenges on how we communicated to voters. And I want to walk you through that. If you could go to the next slide, please. So just a timeline on this Westminster recall. March 12th, we mailed ballots out to voters. On March 20th, the governor issued his executive order. And on March 25th, we mailed supplemental VIGs and postcards to voters with COVID-19 information. One of the things that we did in the communication was make it very clear that due to COVID-19 restrictions and the safety of not only our staff, but voters, we were limiting in-person voting only to our Santa Ana location. And so that eliminated several vote center locations in the city of Westminster. And I should probably add that we are a vote center county. I think most of you know that under the Voters' Choice Act. And so we already have the infrastructure built in for drop boxes and other abilities for voters to return ballots quickly and easily. But it made that challenge because voters were already starting to return ballots, and then we switched kind of midstream to this no in-person option. If you go to the next slide for me. One of the things that we did is mail out a postcard immediately to the voters. This was a large postcard, it wasn't a small one. And on the back was very clear, large urgent notice that in-person voting locations for the City of Westminster election were closed due to COVID-19 restrictions. And we gave them options on that card for a couple of things. One is a remote accessible vote by mail access if they fell into that category, voters with disabilities. And we also included information about COVID-19. And if they were impacted from a medical perspective of COVID-19, they could go into that RAVBM solution and use that as an option for them. Interestingly enough, only 13 voters accessed that system. Nobody returned a ballot under the RAVBM solution. So that was interesting. Next slide. And by the way, that was in all languages to all voters in Westminster. Did a lot of press releases, a lot of information out to the media. We tried to spread this far and wide as much as we could. We worked with the City of Westminster to get information out to voters. And surprisingly, we did not receive a lot of phone calls in terms of voters being confused or not sure what to do. We had information on our website in all the languages that we support in the city of Westminster. And we got some good coverage just in terms of getting information out to voters. Next slide. So updated our letter in the voter information guide for supplemental VIGs that was sent out. That was in red. I have a letter that you see right there at the beginning of the VIG and explaining to voters their options. And their options were, everybody got a ballot. We told them when it was mailed. Everybody has the option of returning that ballot in a variety of ways. Postage paid in the mail. They could drop it off in the City of Westminster drop box, several locations throughout the city that they could use, or they could come into our office in Santa Ana and use an in-person option if they had no other options for casting a ballot. Website's really important. I think we did see a lot of traffic just initially when we first mailed out those postcards where voters were going on and looking for information about what to do with respect to casting a ballot. Now, this is one of the things I wanted to bring up in terms of people asking me, do you think turnout's going to be up or down in the November election? Hard to predict, but what I saw in Westminster, highest turnout in a special recall election in 25 years in Orange County. Now, I guess that could be two things. One, that could be the politics in Westminster are very intense, and sometimes that's going to drive an engaged turnout, but it could also be a product of, hey, I'm at home, I'm in quarantine, I've got a ballot in front of me, and therefore I'm going to take an extra step maybe to engage and participate in this election when I may not have done that otherwise. So I think that was good that we saw that high turnout and engagement. Next slide. Notice of vote center closures were posted on all of the in-person sites so voters could see that. I'm going to kind of fast forward here because we're running out of time. Next slide. This is a picture of, it was raining pretty hard for a couple of days for the in-person voting. And what I saw, and this is something I've talked to my colleagues about, is that the campaigns are driving people to the in-person option. It was not the voters that were calling us saying, I need this in-person option. So we had about 70 total that turned out to vote, driven mostly by campaigns, and I think we're definitely going to see that in November. Risk limiting audit, we conducted that for the City of Westminster. That was using social distancing. I won't go into too many details here other than to say that was a lot easier to manage than the election itself because we were able to social distance in our building. Next slide. This is the fun one. I'm in the middle of a recount for the City of Westminster right now, and we're running two boards, social distancing, online, video observation for the observers, as well as the ability to challenge ballots. This is crazy. And I say crazy in a good word, just in terms of the logistics and the challenges of managing the space and still providing the rights that people have in a recount. And that was certainly a challenge, but I think we made it work pretty well. Next slide. Just some more pictures of the recount. Let's advance if we could, please. I know I'm about 30 seconds out here. Just real quick for the Santa Ana recall, this was, again, a good thing because the governor's order came out before we mailed out anything to the voters. And I see I'm out of time, so if we could just advance a couple slides, I want to talk just quickly about November. You can see some information there from Santa Ana. Vote by mail inserts, good information out to the voters, closure signs, we can go through that website, thank you. We have in-person voting currently right now. Okay, so lessons learned. Definitely the communication for voters and knowing that the campaigns are going to be driving heavy in-person turnout. I know this for November, and that's something we've got to plan for and be able to properly social distance people in those minimized locations is going to be very difficult. And so I think that's something we all need to be cognizant of. Next slide and I'll be done. Challenges for November, finding people. We know this. Logistics for finding locations. We're already talking to sites that do not want to participate. So this is going to be a challenge and we have to communicate correctly to vote to these locations and understanding we're partners in this and making sure that voters have their rights and the abilities to cast a ballot in November. But I also would acknowledge that we are a VCA county. We have an infrastructure kind of built in for this already, but there's still challenges for VCA counties. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to present.
Hi, everyone. Next, we're going to go to Fred, but just really quickly, I just wanted to ask Neil a couple of questions that have come through on the Q&A, and I'll just ask them both at once so we can be quick here. So how, Neil, what is your plan for reaching voters in Orange County jails? And how does the procedures that you've outlined apply to those folks? And then the other question that I think that we can go ahead and answer now is how you protected confidential voter information while live streaming your recent recount activities.
So two great questions. One of the things that we're going to be doing very closely is working with our local sheriff's department on that jail outreach. We have done some, I think, really good work with the ACLU to make a robust outreach plan to inmates in the jail system. And we're not going to stop that. That's something that we're going to work closely with our sheriff's department on, and also use COVID-19 communication to these folks and letting them know what their options are. For the recount itself, we have protected ballots that might have distinguishing marks on them so that when people see that on the video live stream, that's something that would be redacted and they would not see that information. I think that's where your question's going, Jessica.
I think so.
Yeah, and also just making sure that you see the tally sheets and the ballot itself that's being called side by side, and so people can compare them as they're being marked, and they can also raise challenges on the online streaming service as well.
Okay, perfect. Next, we're going to go to Fred, and Fred, you can take it away.
California, and at the performing rights team. We are glad that the governor is representing for require every voter to get before mail ballot in November. Many voters with disabilities are more vulnerable populations for the virus, and voting by mail would be the best way to protect them. And a lot find it more convenient, but many people with disabilities need to vote in person in order to help from over or vote privately and independently using the account accessible public equipment. And a lot of people with disabilities working home or over residential facilities have been coerced into living a certain way by keeping at the home, and they walk over them to complete a ballot. Next slide. The one of the most accessible, but female with a lot of voters with disabilities, more a female ballot and 20 hours mail in the own flexible equipment to more obvious about we video on website. Our YouTube channel. Next slide. Some drawbacks are both some voters don't have access to the computer over internet that is overpopulation and people in rural areas. We have heard that some people don't feel private enough because some people may have buried in the envelope. And what Neil says, a lot of people try to use it and give up. That's what new. A lot of people get it, but no, never back. Needs to be more outreach. Go ahead. Next slide. There needs to be a minimum number of in-person voting locations. I believe that 1 in 10,000 voters is a possibility. We think that would be the compromise to allow for access and safety. Next slide. Then it should be accessible. Like under the VCA, non-VCA counties have a flexibility in that. Next slide. But that there'll be a lot less voting locations will make it harder to get the next location. I'm almost done. The next slide is that number accessible voting machines should be at least 3 in case one breaks or better life or both. Just like the VCA. And out of time. Just at the right time. Thank you.
In the interest of time, we're running a little bit short, so I'm going to go ahead and go straight to James, and then we'll pick up questions at the very end. Does that work for everyone? All right, James, it's all you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Schwab, Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Alex Padilla. And we're going to start off with a discussion on where we're at with the November election. So next slide, please. The opening slide right there is an image from Wisconsin. and their primary election. We're hoping that Wisconsin and the lines we saw there and the impact and effect of the virus had on voters and poll workers that participated in that special election, we hope is not a preview of November, but a warning for us and what we need to do in the next 6 months to prepare. So what do we know today? We know that at some level, the virus will be impacting the election in November. And in October, November, and December, the important months for the election. We don't know to what extent or to what level, but I think all signs point to some level of impact, including ongoing health guidelines, social distancing directives, and others. So I think number one is we know there's not going to be a vaccine. And so public perception and reality of what voters are thinking and how they want to vote might change by the fall, given the fact that the lack of vaccine and we don't know exactly where we'll be with how prevalent the virus is going to be and how strict orders will be in the fall. We know that today the virus is impacting in-person voting locations and poll workers. And so you heard from Neil earlier, essentially as of today, we're simply losing locations and losing poll workers. Counties are doing their due diligence. They're reaching out to their communities. They're reaching out to their locations, and they're getting non-commitments or they're getting turned down. So we have a tremendous job ahead of us to fill that gap. We know that state and county budgets are severely impacted. At the state level, there's a $54 billion deficit that needs to be resolved. Just today, we were informed that our agency is going to face a 5% budget cut. Our employees are going to face a 10% pay cut, with furloughs likely coming. So in terms of resources available for November, it's even tougher road ahead. And we know that in-person voting options will need to change. And I say this not because of necessarily the number, but what they look like, how they feel. I think there's a range of items we need to do to make voters feel safe and confident that going to an in-person voting location will not endanger their health, that it can be a safe and healthy and secure way of voting. And so the look and feel of polling place is going to need to change. And election officials are going to have to add another hat to their responsibilities, and that's public health official. And again, another challenge for us looking ahead to November. So to give you a sense of what types of locations are used by counties, these are the kind of categorized locations by type. A significant number of locations are schools, religious facilities. A lot of the other category are, we think, garages or other private businesses or spaces. But you can look, there's a lot of facility types that might not be available to election officials in the fall. And so just to get a sense of sort of what's out there and some of the gaps we need to fill. So what's being done? Through the month of April, early March and early April, my office convened a working group to bring together our stakeholders from across the spectrum to discuss sort of, how do we respond to for November. We had daily meetings. We had sometimes 2 or 3 meetings a day, depending on our subcommittees and different topics we walked through. And we really dived deep on, how things have gone in the past, into the weeds in terms of the vote by mail process, conditional voter registration, USPS, the technology portion of it and the equipment needs, and try to understand a lot of what's working well, what might need to change. And we came up with a long list of specific recommendations for policy consideration, executive order, legislation, funding, guidance, and regulations. And the goal was to submit those to the legislature and the governor for action. I think a lot of that work will be incorporated into the legislation that's being introduced in both houses and possibly in a future executive order. And I'll get to the specifics of the working group a little bit later on, but that's in general. We came together, we did some work, we made recommendations, and I think we have a good grasp of a lot of the little items that need to be tackled. But sort of the big picture, which we'll talk in a minute about, is the in-person voting, the number of in-person voting requirements. We also have the Federal CARES Act, which is providing $36 million in federal funding to California and can be used for anything related to elections and responding to the virus. As I mentioned, there's state legislation that's been introduced. There's actually another federal bill, the HEROES Act, introduced in Congress that would appropriate another $3.6 billion to elections. There was the executive order on March 8th, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that just focused on sending every voter a ballot, registered voter a ballot for November. And then we're working towards finalizing those in-person requirements. And so this is sort of the hot topic. This is the controversy, is what do we do for in-person requirements? What's possible for November? We know that today, no one is saying yes. We know that the people that are going to staff those locations aren't signing up. We have a tremendous work ahead of us to find those locations, think creatively about what we can replace those locations with, and find the people to staff them. So that's sort of the final piece of here before we can really finalize our work and look for November. So here's a list. I know my time's running long. Here's a list of the other smaller items we got through with the working group. So there wasn't consensus on in-person requirements, but everything else there was good consensus on. Public education campaign, extending the voter registration deadline, extending the postmark +3 law, expanding the use of our ballot tracks technology, protecting language and disability access, expanding the use of remote accessible vote by mail, and engaging the USPS often so that we can ensure we understand the reality on the ground for the Postal Service. So the challenges ahead, what we're trying to do is unprecedented. Not only before the virus was wildfires and public safety power shutdowns, cybersecurity, misinformation going to be a challenge. We now have a virus in front of us, and what we're trying to accomplish by changing the amount and number and demographic of poll workers for November has not been done before by county election officials in our office. We're going into uncharted territories, and there's a lot of work ahead of us. That includes identifying, surveying, and committing likely 3,600 sites in the next 3 months. We need to make sure those sites meet operational accessibility and public health needs. We need to support counties moving to all vote by mail, recruit 26,000 plus poll workers, figure out how we're going to get money from a deficit, and then layer in the other challenges I mentioned earlier. It's going to be a tremendously difficult election for everyone. We need all hands on deck to support counties, to support our office in getting the election done. Thank you, Gail. Next slide. 2020 is the year we have to move mountains if we're going to succeed and provide an election that our voters deserve, uphold voting rights, but also an election that is safe and secure for election officials, their workers, and their volunteers. So final slide, and I'll leave you there.
Okay. All right. So we just have a few short minutes for questions. But I think that let's start with this one and see how long it takes us. One viewer is asking if there are any counties that appear to be doing a particularly bad or a particularly good job to make sure that the voting centers are accessible and that there are sufficient functioning, accessible voting machines. So any of you that feel comfortable addressing this can do so.
Okay, so I don't want to speak for my other county colleagues, but I will tell you this, that one of the things that we did early on in the VCA adoption was to make sure that we have 5 accessible devices instead of 3, which is required in statute, and making sure that we have adequate space, adequate distance for voters to be able to use a site. Now, this is the one thing I want to bring up as a challenge. I need sites that are about 1,200 square feet or more to have adequate social distancing, and we'll have to reduce the number of the disabled devices in order to meet that threshold. So I think, yes, the answer for us certainly is we're working towards that and planning for that. One last thing I want to add is we built a vote center lab just recently and opened that in our warehouse, which is kind of like Taco Bell in the corporate headquarters, where you have a Taco Bell store inside. And so you can test and you can try things and you can plan for what you're going to do in November. And we're doing that right now.
Okay, great. And then the last question, and this is for James, is with the California State University system announcing that they were going to be doing the vast majority of their classes online in the fall, have there been active discussions with that system to utilize their campus for in-person voting locations, since they'll have access to parking and fewer people on campus?
Yeah, I think I also heard similar movement from the UC system. And I know at least here in Sacramento, the community college system here is moving to online for the fall as well. So I assume community college districts will be doing the same. So I think that presents a couple of challenges. One, how are we going to outreach to college students? Usually they're on campus. You put a vote center there, they're going to show up and vote. And so college outreach is going to be a challenge for the fall. I think each county is going to have to assess how that campus works for their larger community. There are some campus vote centers that just cater to students. I think mostly students and staff. There's others where it was a blend of community members plus students. So I think on a campus by campus basis, we'll need to work with the UC, CSU, community college districts to see what can be available. The secretary's talked about, if it's probably a more safe and healthy option if there's actually no one on campus, right? There's less people that you're interacting with that might be a vector for the virus. And so it's going to be important to have colleges available for polling locations and vote centers. The question is, does it work for each of the counties depending on their specific needs?
Okay. And then the last question that we'll do, we can go over by just a minute, is and what are the rules in place for disqualifying vote by mail ballots? This particular questioner says that his was not counted.
So there's the missing signature, and then there's a mismatch signature. And for both of those issues, the county is required to reach out to you and provide you with notification about how to fix it. And that voter has until 2 days before certification of the election to fix whatever issue is available, whatever issue came up. I also want to plug ballot tracks. We want to expand it to every county in the state. It's like FedEx or UPS for your ballot. You can track it, and it sends you notifications, including a notification if there was an issue with your ballot. You get a text, an email, or a voicemail. And maybe Neil can get into the weeds about the signature mismatch process, but in general, those are the two ways you can have your ballot rejected. But there is a good opportunity for you, an opportunity for you to fix it in the weeks after Election Day.
Jessica, can I just add, it might be interesting for the viewers to note that about 30% of voters on average are responding to those notices. So that continues to grow.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the time that we have. This was a great panel. I would encourage the folks who did not get their questions answered to reach out directly to me or to the other panelists in the event that you still have a burning question that we didn't have time to get to. But thanks so much, guys, for being here and participating on this panel. This was great.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Hope you're able to grab a cup of coffee or an iced tea. I'm Paul Spencer, and I have the honor of introducing the next panel. I'm an attorney with Disability Rights California and our Voting Rights Practice Group. I'm also a FOST Advisory Board member. So our second panel today is very timely because Governor Newsom recently announced that every California voter will receive a ballot in the mail for November. So this panel will discuss what we need to consider when expanding voting by mail in a state as diverse as California. So this panel is moderated by Kim Alexander, president and founder of the California Voter Foundation. The California Voter Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that advances the responsible use of technology in the democratic process and seeks to improve the voting process to better serve the needs and interests of voters. So thank you, Kim, for tackling this important topic today. And I will turn it over to you and let you introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Great. Welcome to the second panel. What do we consider when expanding voting by mail in a state as diverse as California? Please head on to the next slide. I'm going to just show you a couple quick slides. Here's me and California Voter Foundation logo. California Voter Foundation did a study in 2014 to look at the use of vote by mail in 3 counties, and that's up on our website. I invite you to come look at it. Go go on to the next slide, please. I'm happy to say that a lot of the things that we suggested in that study have been implemented, but we have a persistent problem in California with vote by mail ballot rejection. On average, about 1.7% of ballots cast as vote by mail ballots in the state get rejected. And this is primarily due, as was said earlier, to late arrival or problems with voter signatures. Next slide. So we are currently conducting a study with the California Civic Engagement Project, examining mail ballot rejection in Sacramento, Santa Clara, and San Mateo counties. And this study is being funded through grants from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and the County of Sacramento. If you could advance the next slide. And just to mention, we will have some findings coming out about that soon, and Mindy Romero on this panel will be sharing a couple of preliminary findings. We do hope to expand the study to look at more counties, more elections, and even possibly more states. For the March primary, California Voter Foundation developed some social media graphics to help more voters successfully cast vote by mail ballots. And I want to invite voter outreach groups to use these graphics, customize them if you like. I'm just going to throw them up on the screen here real quick. If you go to the next slide. This is one that we made. What do you do with that ballot you get in the mail? Fill it in, sign the envelope, and get it in on time. Next slide shows who to contact if you have voting questions. And the next slide shows, reminds voters that you can check your voting status online, your registration status, your ballot status. These are great tools. So I think, as James Schwab mentioned, it would be great for all of us to encourage voters to utilize these tools for November. Next slide. So we have three wonderful people to hear from on this panel. I'm going to just give you a quick introduction about each of them. First of all, we have Courtney Bailey Canelos. She is the Registrar of Voters for Sacramento County. She has 15 years experience in voter registration and elections. She was a key figure in the transition from polling places to vote centers for the county's implementation of the Voters' Choice Act in 2018. And she chairs Sacramento County's Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee and is a member of the State Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee. Our second panelist, actually he'll be our third panelist, is James Woodson. He's the Senior Policy Manager for California Calls, where he manages the organization's work around the 2020 census, redistricting, and the Voters' Choice Act. He is a member of the Secretary of State's VCA Task Force, as well as the Voters' Choice Los Angeles Steering Committee, and he is also on the leadership team of the Black Census and Redistricting Hub. And our third panelist is Mindy Romero. She is the founder and director of the California Civic Engagement Project at the University of Southern California's Saul Price School of Public Policy in Sacramento. She is a political sociologist with a PhD in sociology from UC Davis. Her research focuses on political behavior and race/ethnicity and seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in California and the US. So we'll turn it over to Mindy and her slides. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Thanks.
I have a lot of data to present to you, and I'm going to be going through it pretty quickly. Know that just about everything that I'm showing you is currently available up on our website. So most of it is research that we've done over the last number of years, published in a variety of different research briefs. And then, as Kim already mentioned, at the end of my slides, or near the end of my slides, I'm going to present briefly some new research from the study that we're doing together with the CCP and the CBF around ballot rejections. So next slide, please. Just jumping in. Just making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of just the current status of vote by mail in California and kind of the trend over time. Next slide. This is data just directly from the Secretary of State's office. Simple slide just showing how we have increased in the proportion of our ballots that have been vote by mail over the last decade and a half. So looking at the general election in 2004, 32% of all ballots cast in that election were vote by mail ballots. And of course, not all of those go through the mail. A good chunk of those in any given election get dropped off. To the most recent primary in March, where we saw 72%, and that was the largest proportion that we've seen thus far in our state. 72% of all ballots were vote by mail ballots, whether mailed or dropped off. Next slide, please. And we shall see what November brings us, especially given the governor's order establishing that everybody will be mailed, every registered voter will be mailed a vote by mail ballot. Now, in addition to our increase that we've seen in the use around vote by mail and the proportional use around vote by mail, we know that there are still significant disparities by race, ethnicity, age, and a number of other statuses when it comes to actually using vote by mail. So just showing you some recent research, the most recent general election 2016, that number was 58% member for everyone. We have it again on this chart in front of us. But for Latinos in that election, 47% of their ballots were vote by mail ballots. So not 58, but 47%. For Asian Americans, 66% of their ballots cast were vote by mail ballots. And we don't, for this study, we don't unfortunately have data for African Americans or whites, but just to show for Latinos and Asian Americans, very different there in terms of the proportion of their ballots that are vote by mail. Next slide, looking at age, just really quickly, just slide simply shows the different kind of established age groups in California and their use around vote by mail. So ranging from 53%, again in the 2016 general election, 53% of all 18 to 24-year-old ballots cast, age 18 to 24, to 71% of those ballots cast by folks that are 65 plus. Next slide. Okay, so why do California voters choose vote by mail instead of voting in person? So our research center has done a lot of work trying to understand voting behavior and a lot of research around this choice. And I'm really careful to underscore here, the word choose is not always a choice, right? There are significant reasons why, and I'll talk about this in a moment, why voters do use in-person voting options or use the mail, whether they drop it off or actually put it through the mail ballots. And for some folks, these amount to real constraints. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding that that choose sometimes is not always such a simple equation. Next slide. So this research, as I said, I'm going to go through a number of research studies. This research is from a representative statewide survey we did a couple election cycles ago. And we found that typically VBM, vote by mail voters, why do they use vote by mail? 72% of them said it was more convenient than going to a neighborhood polling place on election day. And they could pick multiple reasons why they choose vote by mail. 67% preferred to fill out their ballots in a place where they could look things up on the internet. 60% didn't want to wait in line at their neighborhood polling place, and about half preferred to fill out their ballots where they could discuss it with family and friends. Next slide. There we go. For polling place voters, overwhelmingly, why they choose to, choose in some form to use an in-person experience, 97% said it was because that polling place was convenient for them to get to. So it was in their neighborhood, it was their children's school, it was close by in some way. It felt like it was the logical thing for them to do, right, being convenient. 90% going to the polling place on election day was an important part of their voting experience, how they defined the voting experience, and 64% wanted to get the sticker, the vote by mail, the high voter sticker. Next slide, please. Some group differences. So I'm going to switch over to the same study. It was a multi-method study, but moving away from the representative statewide survey, we also did focus groups with historically underrepresented groups in our state. So now I'm going to talk about that research, those findings from the focus groups. So for folks that were typically vote by mail voters, Latino vote by mail voters noted that work hours can sometimes make it inconvenient to go to the polls, so that's why they use VBM. They also talked about a preference of being able to consult with family when making their voting decisions, so around the kitchen table, so to speak. For those that chose polls, our focus group voters that were Latino said, or at least generally Latinos were more likely than members of other groups to cite the social aspect of voting as a reason for voting in person. And the young voters really talked about wanting that first-time voter experience to be in person. Next slide, please. So we also did focus groups with voters with disabilities, and we heard, as Fred's already talked about a moment ago, Fred Neeson, if you were on the earlier panel, a strong desire to be seen representing the disability community and a highly value the right to cast a private ballot at a polling place. So we heard that quite strongly in our focus groups. And that's putting aside the comments that we also heard around the frustration around being able to get to an accessible voting machine, whether there was one, whether it was working, whether it was available to them. We also heard, and I want to make sure that I note this, desires, and this is more broadly from folks, a desire around language assistance, folks that needing language assistance, wanting to make sure that wanting to go to the polls because they could get that assistance there. And also heard a lot about just needing assistance with their vote by mail ballot. Either they didn't get it, there was an issue with it, they damaged it in some way, needed it replaced. Questions around the vote by mail process, leading those voters to go to in-person location. And I think maybe one or two of our panelists might be talking about that a little bit later, so I'll move on from there. Next slide, please. And then we also conducted focus groups with African American voters, and we actually released a brief on this, a research brief, which is on our website if you want to learn more. But again, just giving highlights here today. The most commonly shared reasons for voting in person from African American voters that we talked to was a lack of confidence and trust that their vote would be counted if their ballot were to be sent through the mail, a desire to be seen representing the African American community when voting, following a family or community tradition of voting in person, a strong desire to enjoy the social aspects of voting, and also wanting to represent, especially for kids, and being seen wearing that vote by mail sticker. Next slide. We also heard about trust. Trust was a big part of our research, came up in the focus groups, and then now I'm going to switch over back to our representative statewide survey that I mentioned to you a little while ago. We heard so much about trust in the focus groups, we made sure to include that in our representative statewide survey. And specifically of those voters that didn't send a vote by mail ballot through the mail. So either they were a vote by mail ballot voter, but they dropped it off, or they were typically a voting in person voter. Those respondents, 27% of them said they didn't trust the USPS to get their ballots delivered safely on time, so they weren't using the mail for voting, or in time to be counted. But there were differences by race ethnicity quite significantly. So 29% of Latinos said they didn't trust the USPS, 32% African Americans, and 47% of Asian Americans didn't trust the USPS to get their ballot in on time. Age also a difference, 36% of young voters age 18 to 29, and 29% of older voters 65 plus. And I see Gail's giving me the time here, and I just wanna give a brief reminder. I think I was given a couple extra minutes for my slides, so hopefully she's calculating that in there too. Next slide, please. In this chart here, the slide is just visualizing everything that I just said. So we're going to make these, all of these PowerPoints, of course, available, and I'll let you look at the details on that later. Next slide, please. Rejection rates in California. So vote by mail use has increased quite significantly, but of course, vote by mail ballots have to be verified. They have to get there on time, even with our new law postmark plus 3 days, but they have to also be signature verified. Next slide, please. So from our research at the California Civic Engagement Project, we know that, well, first off, just simply rejection rates have fluctuated. So the rejection rate is simply the share of vote by mail ballots that are cast in any given election. What percent of those VBM ballots didn't get counted? They were rejected. Next slide, please. So this chart just visualizes what was on the slide previously, that the rejection rate in California has fluctuated. In the 2018 general election, it's 1%. We don't yet know what it was for, or at least I don't have the knowledge of what it was for the primary yet. So 1% of our vote by mail ballots rejected in November 2018. That equated to 85,000 ballots that were rejected. Next slide, please. This slide is just simply, this chart is visualizing what I just said. You can see the 85,000 in November 2018 was actually more than what we saw in the November 2016 election. And as, of course, we increase in the proportion of ballots that are vote by mail and the overall number of vote by mail ballots, even if we kept the rejection rate the same and low and steady over time, it still is a proportion of a larger pie, right? And so that's something to consider. Next slide, please. And we've done a lot of research at the CCP also to identify, and this is again in different sets of research products, that there are rejection rates, as a state as a whole vary very significantly by subgroup. So the 1% in 2018 varies by race, ethnicity, age, military status, language preference, again, what's in the voter file, right, as what people want for their, or at least identified in the file as their language preference around their materials. Voting method, whether they drop it off, whether they mail it. Nativity, geography differs significantly by county. And you can look all of that up for some additional information if you're interested. The top 3 rejection rates are always late, Signature doesn't match and no signature, but this does significantly vary by county and by subgroup within county. Next slide, please. And I just am getting a text from somebody. Yes, the slides again will be available, I think, to the Future of California elections. So now I'm going to talk just really quickly about that new study that we're conducting in partnership with CVF, California Voter Foundation. These are preliminary findings. We haven't yet released the research. And this is focused on 3 counties, as Kim said, Santa Clara, Sacramento, and San Mateo. Next slide, please. There. Their rejection rate, specifically again for the November 2018 general election, state as a whole was 1%. Sacramento was 8% of VBM ballots rejected. Sorry, 0.8. Sorry, Courtney. Santa Clara was 0.7. San Mateo, 1%. Next slide. And I just wanted to emphasize, just for time, I'm just going to show age. But those age 18 to 24 young voters are overrepresented. So as an example of what I said earlier about groups having different types of rejection rates, well, it means that they can be over or underrepresented amongst vote by mail, amongst those that are rejected, those ballots that are rejected. So here in Sacramento, young voters were 20% of rejected ballots in the November 2018 general election, but they were only 6.7% of VBM voters overall. In Santa Clara, 25% of all ballots rejected, but 7% of VBM ballots overall. San Mateo, 21% versus 6%. Next slide, please. Almost done. These 2 charts just visualize what I just said. You can see on the far left, 18 to 24, this is their percent of rejected ballots in these counties. Next slide. And the bar chart simply goes way down, right, because they're a much smaller percentage of the vote by mail population in each of these counties. Next slide, please. So lastly here, the other thing that we want to note that specifically in Sacramento County, in the last 3 elections, most ballots rejected were due to lateness in recent elections. Due to lateness in those last 3 elections. They're postmarked after Election Day, could not have been accepted even with a longer grace period for arrival. That's something to note. A significant percentage of ballots are not postmarked or have an unreadable postmark. And what that all means is that increasing awareness about USPS pickup practices and dating one's signature on the ballot envelope could help reduce ballot rejection due to those late postmarks and missing or unreadable postmarks. Last slide, in conclusion, we'll see, we expect that our vote by mail use rate in California will likely be higher in the primary, given everything we've been talking about. We'll see what that is. But to keep in mind that there are historic patterns of disparate vote by mail use, right, across race, ethnicity, and all the other groups that I mentioned. Important reasons why people choose to vote in person that can be real barriers to voting and transitioning to the mail. Greater numbers of rejected ballots in 2020. And disparities again in those vote by mail rejection rates. And just a quick note, very soon in our May 21st presentation, that event, if you've heard about it, that we're putting on for LA County with of course the Future of California Elections and the LA County Elections Office, we're going to also be presenting briefly some new research around how voters are thinking about voting in November. And next slide, I'm done. Sorry for going over there a little bit. And we can skip Q&A if you want to move on to the next panelist.
So we're just going to kind of go over a bit of the logistics today for Sacramento County and what we've seen with switching to all vote by mail. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is a chart that shows the vote by mail trends in Sacramento County over time. You can see how it really changed. So we started in November 2000, and then around November 2008, we were really seeing a split between voting in person and voting by mail. And then we saw an increase through 2014, 2016. And then, of course, when we moved to the Voters' Choice Act in 2018, we saw that big jump. You can also see by this chart that for general elections, we always see a slightly larger number of people choosing to vote in person. So that's something we definitely have to take into consideration as we make plans for November. Next slide, please. This chart kind of just gives an overview of how people actually return their vote by mail ballot. So for March, we had a significant number use the drop box. We had a significant number drop off their ballots at a vote center, but the most common method was still by mail. But if you consider the drop box and the vote center numbers together, they actually surpass those that chose to return their ballot by mail. This election in March, we did see a 6% increase of people returning their ballot by mail. We're not sure if it's because we had prepaid postage, since we didn't have that in 2018. We also included an I voted sticker in the vote by mail packet this time, because we do have stickers at all of our drop boxes and vote centers. And not sure, just with the current situation with COVID-19, if that prompted more people to return their ballot by mail. So there's a few reasons why we might have seen an increase of returning their ballot by mail versus what we saw in 2018. Next slide. Just to give a little overview of what is done to validate and confirm vote by mail ballots. Since there are a lot of questions regarding security of vote by mail, it's important to understand the basics of the process and know there are different elements to ensure that the processing and the counting of the vote by mail is secure. So in Sacramento County, we do use a mail sorter, which takes a picture of the return envelope in order to do the signature comparisons. We can then use that sorter to sort down for precinct level or by district, by ballot type. Counties do it differently. We kind of do a hybrid where we sort down by precinct level through election day, and then we do a mixed batch after election day. That helps us in order to see if there might be any recounts or close contests we might have to look at further. After that portion, then we go through the signature verification, where we compare from the voter's registration form and any supporting documentation from forms that maybe we've sent the voter over the years. We can also look back at previous registration forms in order to help us make a good comparison as far as if that is the voter and maybe their signature has declined, or as we know, those DMV signatures are not always the easiest to verify the eligibility of the vote by mail envelope. But again, we look at all records possible to count that ballot. If it is challenged, we have a supervisor review the physical ballot to look for any other markings on the envelope, and then we will initiate that voter contact that was discussed earlier. We then move into the extraction of all the good ballots, which I'll talk about more in a moment, and then we'll process the ballots. So any ballots that are damaged or torn, we remake them so we can scan them, and we have quality control teams that go over that process, and that process is observable by the public. We also go over to determine any sort of voter intent issues. So even if maybe they didn't bubble it in all the way or they crossed something out, we can make those determinations and make sure that we count the ballot the way the voter wanted. And then we move into tabulation and releasing of the results. So go ahead and move to the next slide. So things that we take into consideration with the vote by mail. The first one is community input. And I think it's really important to address what your community says on why maybe they're not comfortable voting by mail, especially as we work out voting options through this pandemic. What does your community say about why they're not comfortable voting by mail? And I know Mindy and her team have a lot of great research done on that. And it's important to hear what those comments are so that your messaging can be built around that. Whether or not it's the process, and also making sure that you're opening your office to any sort of observations. I know observations are going to be a little bit more challenging this election, and I saw Neil in Orange County setup, which looked great. Monterey County actually has the coolest setup with glass walls, but that is something you're going to have to keep in mind, whether you do live video streaming. How are you going to open up your process to ensure that when you go through your ballots, people are confident they're being counted? The next item is privacy. One of the big concerns we had when we moved to vote by mail was people were afraid that we were looking at their return signed envelope and how they voted. So we started doing some outreach and media on our extraction machine, and our extracting actually demonstrates that the information is covered up and it goes so fast that we really don't have time to go through and compare and see how people voted. Once we showed the video of using the extraction machines, it seemed to quell some of those concerns about the privacy of the vote by mail process. We do take steps to make sure that everyone's ballot does remain private through this process. We also have the accessibility concerns that Fred touched on and a few others touched on, and we have the accessible vote by mail. The first time we used it, we only had 4 people use the accessible vote by mail. This last March election, we had 52, so we have seen an increase. But again, the messaging and the outreach around that system does need to be improved, especially in the upcoming November election. We have made our a demonstration site go live so that people in our community can start testing it and getting familiar with it now. And we're encouraging sharing those links and kind of the fake credentials we have in order to get used to the system. So we're trying to get the word out on usage and that as a viable option. And then one thing we learned too by working with our community is that we realize for voters who are blind or have low vision, you know, they don't even know what's on the envelope. There are things required by code that tells us that we have to put on the envelope, whether it's the address or a witness or someone authorized to drop off a ballot. But the voters, some of them don't have any idea on what's required in order for a ballot to count. So we're going to try to do more outreach and information, especially on the accessible vote by mail side, to describe what is on the ballot, where the voter should sign. We have 2 hole punched in order to kind of indicate where a voter should sign, and just more information on what that envelope actually looks like. The tracking, we used Ballot Track, so that was very helpful for voters to get the information on if their ballot counted, and they got that immediately. It kind of took us back a little bit, but it also realized where we might need more staff training, and it was great to see such a great turnout. I think it was over 80% of the voters who used Ballot Tracks actually had a returned valid ballot, so it's great to see that usage. And then it's important on the security to know there are multiple steps that we do to ensure that vote by mail ballots are processed securely and accurately. We have the signature verification. We have chain of custody, that's teams and quality control teams of people with the ballots at all times. We have voter contact, reaching out to those voters if something is wrong or if we have any questions. We also have that manual tally or risk limiting audit procedure to show that those ballots are being counted based on voters' intent. Opening the office to observation is a huge part. And then the last item is the one that's, I know a lot of concerns is about ballot harvesting. And that's something that we want to encourage. As we know, there are the code itself states that it allows for people to be able to pick up and return ballots for others. And so we want to outreach to voters to make sure that they are comfortable with who they're giving their ballot to. They understand they have a choice, and if they're not comfortable, don't do it. And so there's a lot of outreach and education on that. And I know Riverside County put out, I think it was in a response to a PRA, but they put out some great code citations and how they follow that. So, so definitely been learning from other counties on how to process that. But we want to encourage voters that keeping their ballot in their hands is the safest option, or give it to someone you trust. And of course, if anyone wants code changes, you're welcome to have. All right, so I think that does it for me. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Woodson. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at California Calls. I think my slides will pop up in a second, but while they do, I want to just kind of highlight, and we can actually just go straight to the second slide, please. And apologies, I think the slides are animated, so you may have to click a couple of times. So, you know, in terms of our focus, I'm really on this call representing a few different bodies. So first is California Calls, which is an alliance of 31 organizations across the state, all community-based organizations. We're part of a larger coalition called the Million Voters Project, which is also a group of statewide networks of community-based organizations. But then there's also the California Black Census and Redistricting Hub, which is 35 Black-led and Black-serving organizations that came together to maximize participation in the census and redistricting processes. If you keep clicking through on the on the right-hand side, you'll see really what our focuses are on. We do integrated voter engagement to these groups, so urban, rural, and suburban counties across the state. We do voter outreach to new and infrequent voters, young people, communities of color, poor and working class neighborhoods. And a lot of the focus of this talk today for me is going to be really kind of taking folks into the world of these folks and the challenges that they might face in using vote by mail. Next slide, please. The first point that we wanted to kind of make is the vote by mail is certainly not a silver bullet. There certainly is a thing around safety with the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of health, but there's also a piece around safety around your ballot, right? And whether you will feel comfortable that your ballot, once it's cast either by mail or in person, is actually counted the way that you want it to be. And so while the state is certainly moving to vote by mail, not everybody is there and not everybody is able to use vote by mail. So I want to just talk about a little bit about the reasons why. And again, if you keep scrolling through, you'll see some of the reasons why folks may not be able to use vote by mail and why it's so important. I know the other folks have lifted this up to have safe, accessible, in-person voting locations. We know based on Mindy's research that some folks don't trust the mail. Some folks actually might need a replacement ballot if they lose it or if they just don't get it in the mail. Folks will need in-person language and physical assistance. There are folks that don't have an address at all, and specifically kind of referring to homeless folks and how would they use vote by mail, right? There's folks that, never will hear about the shifts or the changes. We'll talk a little bit about in a second why folks may not trust sort of government sources of information. And so folks may not actually even hear about the changes and may just get a vote by mail ballot in the mail and not know what to do with it or why they're receiving it. You'll have folks that are new to voting and need in-person assistance, and then folks that aren't registered to vote but want to vote on the same day. And so again, important to have those kind of in-person locations to allow for that. Next slide, please. One of the things that we wanted to highlight here is that really there's a convergence of factors for the November election. So again, if you keep clicking through, we know that the presidential election is coming and that there's typically higher voter turnout, especially of the communities that I mentioned before. And so we'll know that there'll be more folks that want to vote. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has been having a disproportionate impact on a lot of those communities that I lifted up, and we'll talk about that in a second a little bit more. There's government distrust that's at an all-time high. We'll also talk about that a little bit more. And then we know that there's also historic disenfranchisement. And so really these last three factors are the things that I want to focus on in my time that remains. Next slide, please. So again, while we know that the presidential elections tend to bring out more, more voter turnout, we also know that folks of color are being, again, disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, which means there's more unemployment in those communities, there's more displacement, there's more things that folks are having to deal with. And so it's more likely that, again, either folks just don't hear about it because they're either a caretaker or having to work or just having to deal with the illness, or they're less likely to actually receive a ballot because they're living with somebody else, or just not at their address, right? So again, just highlighting the impact on communities of color and the burden that they're facing right now. Next slide, please. The other point here is that we just have to remember the kind of disproportionate impact historically that communities of color have faced, right? We have, folks that really look at, people in power in a certain way, right? Liberty, freedom, and look at America in that way. But you also have folks that have a very different historical perspective, and so are going to be a little bit more hesitant to use vote by mail. Next slide, please. We also know, again, that there's been historic efforts to really disenfranchise folks, across our country. On the left-hand side, you see some of those historic pieces, but on the right-hand side, we know, again, nationally, and not necessarily here in California, but nationally, we have a whole lot of different efforts to really disenfranchise folks, right? And so for communities of color, they're seeing that on TV. Their families are experiencing it. For some folks like me, you've lived in other states and are coming to California with that kind of history from other states. So just remembering that folks have had to deal with a lot of, intentional efforts to disenfranchise folks that are going to, shift their view of how they look at casting a ballot and vote by mail. Next slide, please. The other point here is that we also have other kind of societal dynamics that are happening that are fueling the government distrust. So you have political, racial, social, economic divisions in our country right now. You have increasing white supremacy. The photo on the right was actually taken from California, right? So we know that there's a rise in white supremacy. We have policies that are targeting specific communities. We also have gerrymandering that is happening, and we know that a lot of the citizenship question debate was really centered around disenfranchising and diminishing the political power of communities of color, which are all seeding, again, this government distrust that we see. And the next slide, please, and I'll wrap up here. So implications for our work in particular, again, in our efforts to do voter engagement. One is that we know that we're going to have to do early education and conversion on vote by mail, particularly for folks that are most at risk. We need to teach them how to fill out a vote by mail ballot. We need to teach them that to expect one in the mail and how to return it. So we know that there needs to be a lot of early education on that. We also know, to make people feel comfortable to vote at an in-person voting location, that we'll have to do education on the health and safety protocols that are in place. Because what we don't want is for folks to feel unsafe and so then just stay home and not cast the ballot at all. So we want them to feel safe, that if in-person is the method that they need to use, that they feel safe to use it. Obviously we know that there has to be continued partnerships between election officials and community-based organizations on placements of voting location, on the public education pieces. And again, kind of highlighting this last bullet point, we need a trusted messenger strategy because again, all of the factors that we pointed out around distrust of government, we really need folks from the community that are lifting up the importance of voting, but also how folks can cast a ballot, as we're expanding to vote by mail, but continuing to maintain these in-person locations. And I will hand it back to Kim to take us into Q&A.
Thank you, everyone. That was really a fantastic panel. We had a couple questions that came through the Q&A, and we've been trying to answer them in the Q&A. One that I was attempting to answer is about the graphics that I showed at the beginning from California Voter Foundation. Please contact me at kimalex@calvoter.org. I'm happy to help you customize those graphics for other states. And then there was a question about how do we know the ethnicity of the voters whose ballots are rejected? I wondered, Mindy, if maybe you wanted to hop on and try to answer that question live.
Sure. I actually did answer it in the Q&A. So for time,
okay.
Yeah, I would just refer people there.
Okay, great. And then there was another question about rejected ballots. Just to clarify, there is a new law that does require all voters who have signature issues, whether missing or mismatched signature issues, to be contacted by their county registrar of voters and given a chance to supply a valid signature. So we are making some progress on signature rejection, but we still have some of these persistent problems. Hopefully our new study that's underway will help provide some clues about what else we can be doing to minimize this problem and make vote by mail more successful for all Californians. And with that, I think, unless anyone has any last minute comments or answers to any of the questions that you saw, Mindy or Courtney or James, I think we can turn it back over to Katie.
Beginning in March, the U.S. Census Bureau will invite households across the country to participate in the 2020 census. But what is the census? Simply put, the census is a head count of every person living in the United States. To be sure the government represents the people, the U.S. Constitution requires a population count every 10 years. Ever since 1790, the census has determined the number of seats each state receives in the U.S. House of Representatives. It is, and always has been, a cornerstone of our democracy. We still use it to determine representation, but leaders also use the data to make decisions. Your response helps guide planning for the future of our communities. The 2020 census will help inform decisions on how billions of dollars are allocated annually for critical public services like roads, schools, hospitals and healthcare clinics, fire and emergency response services, and hundreds of other programs. In 2020, for the first time, you'll be able to complete the census online, by phone, or by mail. It asks a few simple questions, like how many people live in your home on April 1st, including their age and sex, and if there are any children living there. You should know that by law, all census responses are completely confidential, and your personal information cannot be shared with any law enforcement agencies. Every person counts, no matter who you are or where you live. So whether your family has participated for decades or the 2020 census will be your first, we all have a role in shaping the future of our country.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Katie Flaherty, the project coordinator for Future of California Elections. We have had a great program and we are now nearing the end. Our final panel discussion will review the question, how do we ensure language access in elections through a COVID-19 response? This panel is moderated by Jonathan Stein, the new Executive Director of California Common Cause. Thank you, Jonathan, for leading this discussion, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you to Astrid and everyone else who worked to make today's virtual conference such a success. I'm Jonathan Stein, the new Executive Director at California Common Cause, and we're here today to talk about language access. So I want to start with a statistic. California has 2.7 million eligible voters who self-identify as limited English proficient on the census, just in the Asian American and Latino communities. That means we have more limited English proficient voters than other states have voters, period. California is truly unique in this respect. In order to build a representative democracy, California has to build the nation's first multilingual democracy. Reaching everyone, including our limited English speaking voters, is harder than ever because we're in a COVID environment. So this panel will talk about language access and all of the different challenges that are part of ensuring language access in the November 2020 election. I'm joined by three fabulous panelists. Fabulous panelist number one is Rosalind Gold. She serves as Chief Public Policy Officer with the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, NALEO Educational Fund. She's also the chair of the FOS Board of Advisors. Fabulous panelist number two is Julia Marks. She's a staff attorney with the Voting Rights and Census Program at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. And fabulous panelist number three is Erin Mendez, an elections outreach coordinator at the Contra Costa County Elections Office. So I just want to make sure that everyone listening today is familiar with the law around language access. So I'll spend just a few minutes covering what language assistance is mandated by federal law and by state law, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists for comments. Section 203 of the Federal Voting Rights Act is the gold standard for language access. It provides a very high level of language assistance for larger language communities. So who receives assistance under Section 203? If an LEP means Limited English Proficient, it's a term we'll use a lot today, I suspect. If the LEP citizens of voting age in a single language community are either 10,000 in a county or are 5% of the citizens of voting age of that county, then everything in that county has to be translated into the language spoken by that language community. That means ballots, vote-by-mail ballots, provisional ballots, voter registration materials, content on the county elections website, everything. By contrast, California state law provides a lighter form of language assistance to smaller language communities. Under Section 14201 and other provisions of the California Elections Code, if the LEP residents of voting age in a single language community are 3% of a precinct, not a county, it's measuring at the precinct level, not the county level, as under federal law, the polling place that serves that precinct needs to have translated reference ballots, called facsimile ballots, translated signage, and other services. Elections officials also must make, quote, reasonable efforts, end quote, to recruit bilingual poll workers that work in that polling place. That means if a smaller language community that is in just one neighborhood, they can get language assistance under state law, but just in that neighborhood, not countywide. So to recap, larger language communities meet the size thresholds under the federal law and thus receive everything translated and are more likely to receive bilingual poll workers. Smaller language communities often trigger the requirements of state law and receive a lighter form of language assistance. So while translated voting information is available online and translated vote-by-mail ballots are available to voters, so much of language assistance available to voters is made available in the polling place. So how do we ensure that language assistance is still available in an environment, in an election in which millions of polling place voters are likely moving for the very first time to a vote-by-mail environment? So we'll tackle that question and more through our panelists. I will hand it first over to Rosalind Gold, our first panelist, for some opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I also want to thank Astrid and all of the folks who helped to make this conference a reality, as well as thank you all of the attendees for joining us. Before I make my opening remarks about our work at the NALEO Educational Fund, I did want to sort of take a chair's privilege to make sure that certain people that I highlight their efforts in working on this conference. So first of all, I'd like to thank my fellow members of the Future of California Elections Board of Advisors. That includes Kathy Darling Allen, Shasta County Clerk, Paul Spencer from Disability Rights California, and Emily Rush from CalPIRG. And just as importantly, I want to do a shout out to the staff of the Future of California Elections, Katie Flaherty, Guadalupe Flores, and again, as many of you know, our Executive Director, Astrid Ochoa. So thank you all so much. Now, back to language access. At the NALEO Educational Fund, our mission is to facilitate full Latino participation in the political process. And so, of course, making sure that Latino citizens can participate in our elections, no matter where their English language proficiency is critical for our mission. You know, Jonathan gave some figures for the LEP community in California. With respect to Latinos, nearly 1 out of 5 Latinos who are eligible to vote in California do not yet speak English fluently. And as we know, voting materials in California are particularly daunting and challenging, whether it's the length of our ballots, whether it's the complexity of our voter guides. So this language access is very critical. And our organization has continually both promoted policies to further language access, but also we are always delighted to work closely with election officials, who I also want to thank for all your work during this, the crises and the challenges we're facing. And we want to continue to work with election officials on best practices for language access. It really is something we have to do together. And again, we are even more so as we're facing a very different world with a pandemic. So thank you all again.
Up next, I'll hand it over to Julia Marks.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. My name is Julia Marks. I'm an attorney at Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, as Jonathan mentioned. First, I'd like to reiterate the thank yous provided by Rosalind. I'm really happy and honored to be here with all these excellent panelists and have already learned a lot today. Just for some background, our team works to protect the voting rights of API and immigrant communities and to promote a more inclusive democratic process. So that means being counted in the census, that means participating in voting, and that also means having a voice in redistricting. Over the last few elections, our program has run a large poll monitoring operation, and we've engaged in a lot of community education work around voting and the VCA. In the course of that work, we've seen some great efforts by counties to reach limited English proficient voters, but it's a big task. And we have also seen instances where voters are not getting the ballots they need in the languages they need, or they can't access the in-person assistance that they need to vote. So as we're looking forward to the November election, we do want to be sure that limited English proficient voters who already often have difficulty accessing elections do have their needs met. We recognize that this will be an enormous undertaking and that ensuring language access, in addition to all types of voting access, is particularly difficult in these times. A couple of our key areas of concern, which we'll get into more detail on later, are that voters understand how they can participate in that November election, and that this includes LEP voters. So the education and outreach is happening in language. We also want to be sure that voters who need translated ballots receive those ballots. And then we want to be sure that voters who need in-person assistance have a place to go to get their help and to vote in person if that's what they need. And we do similarly look forward to collaborating with other community-based organizations and elections officials to make sure that Asian Americans, immigrant communities, and other limited English-speaking voters have full and equal access to the process.
Thanks, Julia. I will now hand it over to Erin Mendez.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Mendez, and I'm the Elections Outreach Coordinator in Contra Costa County. And I'm very honored and happy to be part of this conference once again and part of this panel. And when I was preparing for this, I couldn't help but thinking of how timely and accurate just, you know, the future of California elections, what we're up against, what we have opportunities for. And this conference is a great platform for us as election officials, as well as for the advocates and all the organizations working hard, you know, to make sure that every voter has access to the information. And specifically speaking to the limited language proficiency, English proficiency voters, we want to make sure that those services are in place. And from the standpoint of an election official, we do have an organization, a statewide organization, is the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials. We have various committees and subcommittees working on different aspects of the elections administration, and one of them has to do with voters with specific needs. And I am a co-chair along with my colleague Tim McNamara from Los Angeles on that subcommittee, and we address the issues with specific needs that people have, whether it's an accessibility, a voting process. Language is a big part of it. And we also collaborate with the State Language Accessibility Advisory Committee, the LAC, as well as with the Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee. So all of those platforms are there to integrate the multifaceted work that elections administrators have to deal with. And but I do always look at I'm trying to always look for a silver lining in all of this, and it just gives us a great opportunity right now with to be able to organize, to be able to collaborate, and to be able to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to have their ballot and cast it and understand the process. And as we move through this pandemic together, we can address these issues and make sure that the trusted voices that I know are in this audience right now have the right information, have the right resources and connections with the elections officials, because we cannot do it without the advocates and all the organizations. We need the trusted voices with the right message. So I appreciate this opportunity, and I want to also highlight that this particular mandate, this particular situation that we have right now of everyone getting a vote by mail ballot, we could turn it into, for the limited English proficiency voters, it could give them maybe for the first time an opportunity to actually see their ballot and understand that they don't have to vote on everything to be able to participate, and that they could actually have more time maybe to examine and to be able to reach out for assistance if that is needed, from the election officials, from the particular county. So I want to encourage everyone to think about how we can make this work, because we're all in this together, and we're all going to have to move through it for this November. But I think I look forward to it, and I appreciate everybody's time.
Thanks, Erin. So our panel is going to use a number of questions from me to our panelists to really get into the meat of language access and our challenges around language access in lieu of slides. Before I go there, I want to give you some stats to really exemplify the scope of our challenge. So in California, we have roughly 15 million Latinos. We have roughly 6 million Asian Americans. In both communities, roughly 3 out of 4 say that on the census, they speak a language other than English at home, and roughly 1 in 3 identify as limited English proficient. Now, that's not voters, that's not citizens, that's all residents, but it gives you a sense of how large our Latino and Asian American communities are in California, and they don't even represent the full extent, of course, of our limited English-speaking immigrant communities and our limited English-speaking immigrant voters. So question number 1, James Schwab mentioned in his remarks earlier that people who have served as longtime poll workers are indicating to elections officials that they're not interested in serving in November. If it's going to be difficult to recruit poll workers, it's going to be really difficult to recruit bilingual poll workers. So what are some ideas and best practices around recruiting bilingual poll workers, given the challenges posed by COVID? I'll hand it over to Julia for her answer.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so this will be a challenge, but a lot of the best practices that have applied in the past to how to recruit bilingual poll workers will apply again here. And in some ways will maybe dovetail nicely with the fact that we have a bunch of outreach work to do about the November election regardless. So one of the key things is to be collaborating with community groups on the ground, to find folks who have the language skills who can be recruited to be poll workers. So that could be a civic engagement group, but it could also be something like a church or folks who assemble around a community center or other group that's not directly focused on civic engagement. Another idea is to collaborate with high schools to try to reach diverse families and to get the next generation of poll workers in the pipeline. And then also relying on partners like us who can maybe help connect an elections office with some organizations that they might not know of or be in touch with, but who would have connections to communities that have needed language skills. And then as there is advertising and education going out about the transition to the new election system generally, bringing in the need for poll workers throughout that. We see this in the census space where we talk about census is coming, but then we also say, and they need workers. So it's the messaging is doing 2 roles. It's helping you with your recruitment, but it's also helping you get out the core message to everyone. And then additionally, a few things to make the role of being a bilingual poll worker more appealing to people. So providing a stipend for folks who have the language ability to show that you value that they're bringing that to the poll worker role. Additionally, considering a travel stipend. So if folks need to work at a polling place or vote center that's outside of their neighborhood, they don't feel burdened getting there. And that will allow counties to spread out their bilingual poll workers as needed. And then finally, to uplift the safety best practices that are going to be put into place. So everyone in this group has been doing all this great thinking. All these elections offices have been doing great thinking about how to recruit or how to safely run elections. And the recruiting needs to explain that that is part of the process, so people don't feel like it's dangerous to be a poll worker.
Thanks, Julia. Rosalind, do you want to add?
The only thing I would add is that I think in this new public health environment, the people who are closest and have the cultural competence and the language skills to work with language minority communities, we have a whole group of new people because of the public health environment. And, you know, we really encourage both community organization and election officials to look for new partners. Maybe it's in the health community, who could be people who would be a source for bilingual poll workers. In addition to letting potential poll workers know about, you know, how the in-person environments will be safe, I think it's also good, this is always done, but even more so now, to be very open about, look, you're going to get training, okay? You're not only going to get compensation, but you're going to be trained. The training will, of course, be adjusted to our new environment. So all of these things can also help when we're reaching out to and recruiting poll workers with the cultural competency and the skills that are needed. Thank you.
And we have one comment in the audience Q&A. We're going to get to audience Q&A after we sort of we finish with our facilitated panelist Q&A, but we have one comment in the Q&A that someone could reach out to social studies classes because it would be a good civics lesson for students. And that's a great idea. It's the case that many counties already have a high school poll worker program, and they're in collaboration with their school districts. But if you have connections to your local schools and could facilitate student poll workers, I'm sure your county elections office would love to know about that and appreciate your assistance. Okay, we're going to move to our second question. What are the best practices around translation of elections material? Rosalind? Great.
Thank you, Jonathan. So, you know, when Jonathan first talked about the requirements to provide language assistance, particularly the federal requirements, they cover pretty much everything a jurisdiction does when it touches voters, whether it's voting and registration, informational materials, whether it's instructions at the polling place, whether it's signage, whether it's mailings, whether it's websites. So first of all, again, and many election officials are doing this already, but it's also particularly important when we're going to have vote by mail be probably a much larger part of the work that election officials are doing, is really taking a good inventory and assessment and checklist. And I know election administrators are great at checklists. So making sure there's an good inventory of everything that needs to be translated. In addition, making sure that people have very easy, accessible information about how to get in language materials. So that means, you know, a mailing to people about how to request in-language materials. Think about how websites are set up. You know, if you have a website, you only have a little tiny thing on the top of the website that tells people how they can convert it to another language, that's just not easy to find. You know, whatever the home page is for election information really needs to be able to direct people to get those translated materials from the website as easily as possible. And similarly, for those people who do vote in person, you know, being able to clearly see immediately who at the site they can go to get language assistance and translated materials is very important as well. With respect to who does the translating, you know, many jurisdictions use commercial vendors. They use sometimes court interpreters. And those services do have a fairly decent quality of translation for materials, but we strongly encourage and we're happy to work with election officials on really bringing in other voices to look at and review translated materials. So for example, there may be in a bilingual coordinator or the person who's in charge of language assistance practices at the jurisdiction itself who should be looking at those materials. Ideally, having a feedback from community groups, because idioms are so different, dialects are so different. The more sets of eyes you can get to look at materials and provide feedback better, and providing community partners with enough lead time. Occasionally I think community groups are familiar with a situation where they've been said, you have 2 days to look this over, please give us feedback. It doesn't usually happen that way, but again, the more lead time and the more input that can be obtained on translated materials, the better. Google Translate, not a good idea. It just, no website should just be translated by Google Translate. I think if you've ever used it for anything not election related, you see that it does not work particularly well, and even more so because of the specialized terms that are used in elections. Finally, I would just say that start off having things written. When you look at the English language, that's a starting point. It should be plain language. It should be accessible language. So if your starting point is plain language materials in English, it will make translating into accessible language much easier. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosalind. Okay, we're going to move to our next question. So a question for Aaron. How are elections officials thinking about making these new restructured voting sites accessible to language minority communities, both in terms of their location in the community and how you structure the services that are available inside them?
Thank you, Jonathan. So there's a number of things that we have to consider as we administer elections. And obviously one of the biggest ones is locations and finding the locations. Our previous panelists already touched on that, what a challenging task that's going to be. But in the way that we're handling it too is looking at the fact that if everyone who's registered up to now, gets a vote by mail ballot at home, then their return of their ballot could be at any of these locations because they're not limited to a specific traditional polling place. So there's that aspect that we also need to consider. But in terms of in-person voting experiences, we want to make sure that they are still in the areas where we see, we have maps, for example, our office where we're looking, I would call them heat maps, where we're looking at where the higher concentration of in-person voting is happening, because that's where we wanted to continue to provide them. And that way, the limited resources that we might have, we might be able to strategize better as to where to place them. We've never had a surplus, I think, across the whole state of California of bilingual poll workers. So that is even more important, to know where do we place the bilingual poll workers that or volunteers that we get from the various areas. And like to make the point, some of them might need to be transported or be asked to volunteer in an area that is not necessarily where they live. But being very familiar with our communities and what our trends of voting in-person opportunities are very, very important. The locations, the challenges with the locations is making sure that they meet accessibility guidelines, but they're also have the space constraints, because we want to keep our workers as well safe as well as our voters. So the drop-off locations, a lot of counties are providing much more locations where people can just drop off their voted ballot ahead of time. We don't need postage, like Courtney mentioned in the previous panel. We are the type of services that we will continue to do, and we want to emphasize with all the service organizations and advocates is our voter information guide. That has a lot of information, very specific to the voter, very specific to their precinct, and with all the other alternate services that we might have. Remote accessible vote by mail is a feature that it was spoken about in the previous panel as well, that can address the issues of accessibility in a broader sense, including language. So, and we can have our equipment at the in-person locations programmed to be able to have an official ballot for a person in the language that they need. So there are a lot of different things, but we're all taking all of this into consideration with this new challenges and limitations that we might have. So although the locations may be fewer, perhaps because of logistics restrictions, we want them to be efficient, and we want them to be accessible and visible to voters. So that it's some of the work, and like I said, it's just really knowing our communities and knowing where our voters are and what the tendencies and preferences, including the I voted sticker that we talked about, in the other previous drive-through locations. I know some counties are talking about drop-off locations. We have existing curbside voting that's been in place, for a traditional polling place or for anybody that needs assistance. So maybe expanding a little bit of that definition of curbside, either voting or ballot return. So those are just opportunities for people to still be able to see someone physically and ask their question, but make it more prominent what the information, phone numbers are for our communities and what our language services, expanding on that. So that's what I have right now.
Thanks, Erin. So we have enough time for one more question from me, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, please type them to the Q&A, and I'll track them for our panelists. Last question from me. So in November of 2020, as I mentioned earlier, millions of voters who typically use the polling place and the language accessibility that's available in the polling place are going to be moving to vote by mail. Now, some of them, of course, will continue to vote in person, but a lot of them will vote by mail for the first time. That means we lose that moment when they walk to the table at the front of the polling place and they're asked by a poll worker what language they'd like to vote in. How do we replace that interaction where the voter has been given a couple opportunities, not a ton, but a couple opportunities to identify their language preference for their county elections office in advance of election day? But for a lot of voters, it is that interaction with the poll worker in which they're asked what ballot they want, what language they want their ballot in. That's the last line of defense to make sure that a voter gets language assistance. And for lots of voters, we're losing that. So a question for you, Julia. How do we replace that experience and find out people's language preference in a predominantly vote by mail environment?
Yeah, that's a great question and going to be a challenge, but we have a few ideas for how we can make sure we know that a voter has a language preference before we get to November, so that folks can get by mail the assistance that they need. One of the benefits of doing that is it means we can possibly see fewer people trying to go vote in person. So doing the investment upfront to update language preferences will help make sure voters can get their assistance in some cases without needing to go to the polls. So one way to do that would be to send a mailer to all voters advertising the availability of language assistance and providing an easy way to update that information. So that can be a returnable postcard, an in-language hotline or website. The more options probably the better in terms of making it easy for people to say, yes, I do want a ballot that is in my language under section 203, or I do want you to send me a facsimile that I can refer to for my language under section 14201. So using mail to advertise and solicit response. Also thinking about, if needed, doing targeted mailers where we look at census data on where LEP communities are concentrated and sending mailers to those areas. And then also updating our online voter registration system so that when people register to vote, they have a chance to say if they have a language preference. And so that should include all Section 14201 languages as well as Section 203, just so that we have that record on file. And if someone ends up in a county where that's a covered language, we'll already know that they have that language need and we'll be able to serve them going forward. So those are things we can do for November that also benefit us all long-term by expanding our language access for future elections too.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, I'm going to move to the question and answer section from the audience. I'm going to start with one question from Catherine Miller. Is it appropriate to promote using family members to help non-English speaking relatives with their ballots when possible? The answer, of course, is yes. Which of our panelists would like to take that? Rosalind, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. In fact, we know that family members are often the most persuasive messengers in terms of encouraging people to vote and encouraging people to participate. And certainly our research with members of the Latino community has shown, you know, as we joke, if you want a family member to vote, make sure his or her mother tells him or her to do so. It is perfectly appropriate, you know, assuming there isn't undue pressure. You know, that's going to be family dynamics. But yes, family members can indeed help with translation, or also can help direct people to where they can get translated materials and other information.
And under California law, up to a voter can bring up to 2 people to assist them in voting in a polling place, so long as those people do not represent the voter's employer or the voter's union. So it is it is not just helpful, as Rosalind indicated, it's completely and totally legal. Okay, I want to move to another question. Maybe a question from Aaron, perhaps, representing elections officials. Are there spoken word translations of ballots that can help people who are low literacy or members of the blind community?
Yes, so there are ballot marking devices that we have at every polling place location or early vote site or vote center, satellite offices, you know, county offices that have the audio version of what is on their ballot, and it has it's meant for accessibility, and like I said, in the broader sense, not only limited to a physical or disability that we traditionally think of. So someone with limited English, they could listen to their to the translation of their actual ballot, rewind it, you know, advance it, and so forth. Also, the remote accessible vote by mail option could be something that is available for not only a person who does a lot of their reading, you know, via different software on their particular computer at home, because they can actually read it and use whatever programs that they have, you know, for translating it or for accessibility issues. So that is a way that they can actually be able to read and have sound or a spoken word to it. Both ways, accessible both by mail, remote, or at the ballot marking device.
And another question for Aaron. Aaron, what are some of the most successful techniques you've seen for recruiting bilingual poll workers?
Definitely word of mouth, you know, and the people who are already engaged in their communities, the people that are volunteering from doing the food bank to, you know, the community clinics, that's where you see it, because we see that they are responding to an immediate need in their neighborhoods and in the communities they're serving. Another location where we've had some level of success is at the citizenship ceremonies. You know, not all the time, because not everyone who is a naturalized citizen necessarily has, you know, is proficient, you know, and to the extent that they need in another language, but we do have some success with that. We also recruit a number of our colleague, you know, county and state workers, you know, because they, especially in the health services department, where they tend to do a lot of translation, but definitely the community-based organizations or people who are already engaged and things like that, you know. And word of mouth, once you do it with one time, you bring a friend, you know, it's like the personal reference. They take a lot of pride. A lot of our workers have been doing this for many, many years. And so that's usually the best approach. Is like, I know someone who can help, you know, and many times their own voters, when they've experienced certain challenges and they're troubleshooting, then they say, you know what, I think I could help. So definitely word of mouth and personal reference.
So if any of our audience today wants to serve as a poll worker or can act as a personal reference and point friends and family members to their county elections official, go for it. We have a question from Charles Kim, who notes that sometimes there are real serious challenges with the quality of translation, and notes a couple ideas for how to improve them. And I want to just throw them out to the panel so they can react. One is using a review board of some kind, community member review board, to review translation and modification and presumably to get input on language assistance. Let's put a pin in that for perhaps Rosalind or Aaron to answer, because I think the lack could be sort of an idea worth sharing. And then also using consistent terminology across counties and using the Secretary of State as a place where you translate translate terms once, create an elections glossary, and then all counties use that, use those consistent translated terms. Does anyone want to react to those?
I think many of those ideas are consistent with what we've been talking about. If you want to have some at the county level, a formal advisory committee is very helpful to provide that kind of input, and we think advisory committees are going to be looking for new and different ways to meet. But certainly having a formal committee at the county level, where you get kind of the different perspectives from different language communities is helpful. Now, in terms of the glossary, the Election Assistance Commission, the federal agency that provides support and technical assistance for elections, has indeed come up with a glossary of election terms in many languages already. And the extent to whether that's something the Secretary of State should adopt or should look at is certainly something that's possible, but it's already out there available for election officials who may want to use it.
I'll add a little bit, Jonathan. So I am a member of the Language Advisory Committee too at the state level, and that's something that we're considering using, you know, creating a glossary of suggested terms, because the EAC's terminology, like you mentioned, Russell, tends to be a little bit more East Coast driven. So it's something that we need to be mindful of, that even within California, you know, we have different dialects and different preferences, we know. So that's something to keep in mind as you are trying to make the translations the most usable, you know, for your voters. That's why I keep emphasizing we have to know who our voters are. And one other thing is that there are review periods for a lot of the different documents that come out of that, what's going to be on the ballot. So it's something that maybe we can emphasize, you know, to all these participants, that to take note as to when all of this reviewing steps for the ballot itself, you know, and candidate statements, all of that is all under public review. So there are many, many opportunities in addition to once things are translated, because I know that is a very important thing. So look out on the Secretary of State's website. The dates will be listed as to when documents come out and when the review periods are for various aspects of the election, because we start working on the ballot layout months in advance, you know, and so we need to make sure. But so there are opportunities for people to have input and definitely, you know, be part of advisory committees and being poll workers. That's your great opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. So, Charles, great suggestions in the chat. Reach out to your county elections office to see if they have a language advisory committee, and maybe seek out the state language access advisory committee. I want to thank everyone for hanging in with us towards the end of the day here for this critically important panel. As I mentioned at the beginning, California has the unique challenge of having to build the nation's first truly multilingual democracy if it's going to build an inclusive and equitable democracy. And so as we adjust to COVID realities and tackle those challenges, we have to make sure that language access is always part of the equation. So thanks for your time. Thanks to my panelists today for doing a fabulous job. And with that, I will hand it back over to Astrid and our organizers.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I'll pass it over to Lupe, who will introduce our final speaker.
Hello, I am Lupe Flores, Deputy Director of Communications and Outreach for the Future of California Elections. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Chairman Benjamin Hoffman. He is the chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, and he graciously agreed to address us despite being on the other side of the country. Mr. Hovland has a distinguished career in public service, not only serving as the commissioner as a commissioner on the EAC, but also as a federal officer with the Technical Guidelines Development Committee. He has been committed to improving election administration and removing barriers to voting. His most recent position, he was acting chief counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Rules of Administration, where he was a driving force behind Congress appropriating $380 million in Help America Vote Act. Earlier in his career as the Deputy General Counsel for the Missouri Secretary of State's office, Mr. Hovland focused on legal issues related to the administration of state and federal elections, including recounts, poll worker training, voter registration list maintenance, statewide database matching, voter education resources, and ballot initiative litigation. I'd like you all to welcome Mr. Hovland. Thank you very much again, Chairman, for joining us.
I appreciate the opportunity to join the Future of California Elections and this great group of speakers in discussing this important topic. The novel coronavirus, or COVID-19, is presenting unprecedented challenges around our country, and as this virtual conference has highlighted, the election administration community is facing real challenges determining how best to conduct elections in this environment. At the EAC, we've pivoted substantially to focus our attention on how we can support state and local election officials as they make tough decisions about their primaries and the general election. We've done this by working within the critical infrastructure subsector on a number of products. The EAC is leading a joint working group between the Government Coordinating Council and the Sector Coordinating Council. Essentially what that means, we've got state and local election officials along with private industry experts working with staff from the EAC and the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, or CISA, on a number of documents that address considerations and best practices for voting during the pandemic. The EAC has also hosted a number of Zoom videos or web chats where we bring together experts from the elections field to discuss best practices and lessons learned on particular topics. One of those was Orange County's own Neil Kelly that we heard from earlier today, but I'm hopeful that these videos and the other resources I mentioned can help with the unique challenges election officials face. I also believe these resources are excellent for this community and the participants on this call to provide useful information and background on the election administration considerations that must be taken into account. Much of what we've heard today is on there, and then other issues as well that you really need to look at in figuring out how to best administer an election at this time, or the things that need to be considered. But, you know, ultimately with the 50 states running elections 50 different ways, each state is in a different place determining the best way for their state to proceed. It's been great to hear more today about what's going on in California. But at the EAC, we see this all across the country. And we certainly see that in the grant request letters that we've been receiving from states as we distribute the $400 million in CARES Act funding that Congress provided for elections. The CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th. I'm pleased to report that the EAC awarded all 56 CARES Act grants on April 6th, and currently 54 states and territories have requested disbursement of the funds and submitted descriptions on their anticipated activities. The two remaining states have been in communication with us, and they're going to submit their request as soon as they get approval from their state legislature. But as was mentioned earlier, California's portion of the CARES Act funding is over $36 million. And many of the initiatives Secretary Padilla mentioned at the beginning of this conference are part of California's plan to utilize this funding. In our communications with states regarding the CARES Act funding, we've heard that election officials are anticipating a wide array of costs associated with responding to the pandemic. For example, costs associated with increased telework, such as laptops or mobile IT equipment. Most commonly, we're hearing about increased costs associated with mail ballots, costs like increased printing and postage, additional processing equipment, high-speed scanners, and drop boxes, but also costs that include systematic upgrades that allow online absentee mail ballot requests in some states that need them, or expanding state portals to ensure that voters with disabilities have access to the tools that can enable expanded use of mail ballots. Also, increased needs around personal protective equipment, or PPE, deep cleaning of polling places, sanitizing supplies, expanded curbside access, and certainly looking for new locations for polling places that allow for that social distancing that we heard again discussed earlier. Clearly there's not a shortage of needs or work to be done. And today's conversation has highlighted many of the issues and to me, how everyone's help is needed in getting this done. And while you could certainly, I have the privilege of largely ending things. So, certainly, you could end today overwhelmed by the challenges we're facing. But my takeaway is to celebrate what's being done. And knowing that dedicated Americans like those of you participating today are working to make a difference, working to protect and promote our democracy. We don't know everything about what November will look like. I am speaking to you from a few hours in the future, but not far enough into the future to know everything. But we know much of what can be done to make November better, encouraging our fellow Americans to register to vote or update their registration, helping recruit poll workers and bilingual poll workers. There may be some changes in state procedures, as has been discussed here today, but helping to educate and organize voters will be as crucial as it's ever been to conducting elections in 2020. Again, the need for voter education will be crucial. The need for, as we've heard about today, voters hearing and getting this information from trusted sources, whether that's state and local election officials, or from the communities that they trust. So certainly encourage that. Overall, I'd just say, I'm privileged to serve in this role as the EAC chairman, and I get to see so much of the collaborative work that is happening around the country. I'd like to end by thanking all of you for participating in this virtual conference today, along with all the work that you've done and all the work I know you will do before November. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Hovland, for your leadership and for sharing the work of the EAC. Thank you for joining us from the future in the East Coast. Again, my name is Astrid Ochoa, and I'm the Executive Director of Future of California Elections. We are at the end of our program, and I wanted to offer just a final round of appreciation for everyone. Future of California Elections was founded in late 2011 on the nonpartisan vision of bringing together government and the nonprofit sector to advance California elections. In our near decade of experience, we have seen that collaboration between government and the nonprofit partners have made California elections stronger. You made this happen, and you are making this possible. We need partnerships now more than ever. 2020 has turned out to be a more challenging year than we imagined. It has been taxing for our election officials and our nonprofit partners to pivot from the March primary to now responding to this pandemic. But election stakeholders are some of the most committed and creative people I know. As we focus on the work in the coming weeks and months, I want to encourage us to lean on each other as we have, and to continue working towards our shared goal. Our focus at Future of California Elections will be around public education coming this November. Please stay in touch. Please connect with us. Please let us know what you need and how we can support you. As we conclude, I just wanted to say a few thank yous again to Secretary Padilla, to Chairman Hovland, to all of our presenters for sharing their expertise today. Thank you to our hardworking team. You saw Lupe and you saw Katie. But you did not know that behind the scenes, Gail Pellerin, Santa Cruz County Registrar Recorder and County Clerk, has been keeping us on time. So thank you, Gail. This really is a true cross-sector partnership. Thank you to our board, to our conference planning committee, to our funders, and finally, a big thank you to all of you, our partners. We appreciate all of you. Thank you for your hard work to keep California elections strong. And finally, fill out your evaluation. The link is in the chat box. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and stay healthy. Keep in touch.